Imagine, New Year's Day, 1941, Europe is at war. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and 3 of his aides worked through the day and late into the night on an address that he was scheduled to give to the nation and to the 77th Congress later that week. He had just been elected to his 3rd term as president. In this address, he wanted to introduce his Lend-Lease policy, where the United States would provide war materials to embattled Britain to be repaid in kind at the end of the war. He also wanted to articulate why we would fight if and when that became necessary. Roosevelt believed that war was inevitable, but at this point in time, 11 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the population of America and the Congress did not want to get engaged in a war in Europe. And this is understandable, I think, if you keep in mind that the United States had just come out of the Great Depression, and also the memory of the horrors of World War I were still rather fresh. During this speech, he presented what he called 4 fundamental freedoms that all people in any nation in the world were entitled to, and that were shared by those nations that were allied together against the tyranny that was sweeping across Europe and in the Pacific. January of 1941, Norman Rockwell was a well-known American artist. He was 46 years old. He lived in Arlington, Vermont with his wife Mary and their 3 sons. He had been an illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post for 25 years. And he really was at the height of his career at that point, at this point, January 1st, 1941. The Saturday Evening Post had a circulation of over 3 million copies during the late 1930s. But you didn't have to buy the magazine to read the cover. And Norman Rockwell had many other commissions and illustration work so that his art reached far beyond the Post. Time magazine had, at this time, described Norman Rockwell as perhaps the best-loved American artist alive. And the New York Times had affectionately compared his paintings to the novels of Mark Twain. Of his work at this time, he was quoted as having said, "Most of the time, I try to entertain with my post covers, but once in a while, I get an uncontrollable urge to say something serious." Norman Rockwell had heard FDR's speech. It had been broadcast live over the radio. He had also read and studied it in print. And in the summer of 1942, with the United States at war, he said, quote, "At that time, I couldn't concentrate properly, for they occupied, the 4 freedoms, the better part of my brain," end quote. How could he take the 4 freedoms, which he described as from Roosevelt's noble language, and put them into terms that everybody could understand? As he later recounted, in July of 1942, one night around 2 a.m., he bolted upright in bed. He had an idea. He remembered a town hall meeting in Vermont where local Jim Edgerton had stood and opposed a popular plan to build a new school. Nobody had agreed with him, but he was allowed to speak and he was listened to. That was it, Rockwell thought. That's the freedom of speech. His idea was to take his Vermont neighbors as models and put the noble language and the noble ideas of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and put them in everyday terms, how we experience them in our lives daily. He put together 4 full-sized sketches of ideas for his 4 freedoms. They were 4 foot tall, 3 foot wide, and they were in color. And when he had those ready, he and a close family friend and a fellow illustrator, Meade Schaefer, got on a train and went to Washington, D.C., They wanted to pitch their ideas for posters to help in the war effort. This wasn't for money. This was something he had done previously, doing design work and donating it to the government to help in the war effort. They went to a number of government agencies, including the OWI, the Office of War Information, and they were turned down by all of them. Discouraged, they left DC. Now, on the way back to Vermont, Rockwell decided to stop in Philadelphia to discuss future illustrations and covers for the Saturday Evening Post with their new editor, Ben Hibbs. He mentioned that he had made some sketches of the Four Freedoms and that he had a disappointing trip to Washington, D.C. Ben Hibbs asked to see the sketches, and he became excited. He told Norman Rockwell to drop everything that he was doing and that the Post would publish his Four Freedoms illustrations. Rockwell agreed and said that he would have them to Ben Hibbs in Philadelphia and completed in 2 months. Norman Rockwell struggled with, recomposed some of the compositions, revised others, and it wasn't until 7 months later, in January of 1943, that the paintings were created and shipped to the Post in Philadelphia, 2 years after Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech. The Post ran them in February of that year, one freedom in each of 4 consecutive issues. And they were accompanied by an essay and or a poem that related directly to that particular freedom. They were immediately popular. Over 25,000 readers requested copies that the Post offered at cost. There were plans in place, or being put in place at the time, to create a second war bond drive. And the United States Department of Treasury decided, along with the Saturday Evening Post, to sponsor that drive. It was to show at major retailers in 16 cities nationwide. The Second War Bond Drive, 1943 to 1944, consisted of the 4 paintings of Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms and various other activities and events at each of the stops. It opened in April of 1943 in Washington, D.C., and there was a stop in Detroit, Michigan as well at the J.L. Hudson Company. They had a parade in Detroit down Woodward Avenue that was viewed by over 300,000 people. In Detroit alone, $2.7 million of bonds were sold. And by the time the tour, the Second War Bond Drive tour ended at the Denver Dry Goods store in Colorado, 1.2 million people had seen the exhibition. $133 million in bonds had been sold. Over 450 celebrities had appeared in various formats. And the Office of War Information, the OWI, had printed 4 million posters for distribution. Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms series of paintings must be included among the most popular and the most widely viewed paintings of all time. Normally, they're housed at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. If you go there, they're in a rotunda in the center of the museum, and they are quite a draw and quite something to behold. This year 2018 marks the 75th anniversary of the paintings. And the museum put together a traveling exhibition that includes the Four Freedoms and then also other work by Rockwell and other noted illustrators and artists. And it's titled Rockwell, Roosevelt, The Four Freedoms, Enduring Ideals. They also organized a companion exhibition of contemporary art. They put a call out to all artists anywhere to respond, to make a proposal of how they would reinterpret, revisit, and reimagine Roosevelt and Rockwell's Four Freedoms for creating artwork for inclusion in that show. And it's touring along with the Enduring Ideals exhibition. I was thrilled to be chosen to participate in that show and felt like I was entering into a rich conversation with the Norman Rockwell's art. What I'd like to do is show you some of my artwork as an introduction and then end with the piece that's actually in that show. My own work could best be described as contemporary landscape painting, where Norman Rockwell focuses on painting people and portraits. My work focuses on painting the environments in which people occupy. The first couple of slides are from a series called the Michigan Chronicle series. These were created in the 1980s and 1990s. And they show different views from mostly from lower central and southern Michigan. They bring together a variety of environments to chronicle and record those of the time. So the first slide had on the left an image of the Willow Run factory and a portrait of my sister hanging up laundry. So on the left is a Willow Run, and that might be a plant. When the Rockwell's shows or paintings were here originally in Detroit on the War Bond Drive, some elements of that show went out to war plants as well as to football games. So they had a lot of different activities such as that. So the next slide is also an example of this series. The next series that I wanted to show you an example of is a factory interior series. And I'm interested in chronicling the large plants and factories from the auto industry and from other industries as well, in Michigan in particular, but from other places also. I have an interest in trying to record those spaces before they disappear. This is Buick City plant number 31, Flint, Michigan. It's in the collection at the Flint Institute of Art and currently out on display if you happen to be in the Flint area. And as a side note, the Flint Institute of Arts is a destination museum now. It's went through another expansion and has an amazing collection, and they have amazing programming there. The last series that I wanted to show you as an introduction to my work is called the Glare series, and I'm working on this currently. This is an example of one of the paintings from the Glare series. These bring together a variety of environments into compositions and shapes, but they're not, they can be from anywhere. They're not kind of localized or regional necessarily. So they're a way of exploring how we create and think about place. So this has imagery mostly from around the Akiak Rivershed in that area. And then the last one is a more recent painting called Glare number 17 Fly Tower. And incidentally, the fly tower is the apparatus that lifts scenery up into the sky and lowers it down from the sky for staging. So that kind of related to the way the composition works here. So for if you go to the last slide here, this is an image of Sunday night, Monday morning. This is the piece that is currently touring with the Reimagining the Four Freedoms, the exhibition. And to describe what's there a little bit, on the left is Sunday night, which is the interior of a church as the sun goes down. On the right is Monday morning, is a suggestion of two people walking through a factory as at first light on Monday. So the subject matter is really kind of neither nor and both, as that kind of transition between the day of worship, a day of spiritual reflection, into the day where one goes to work and takes care of business, in a sense, gets back to work. It's meant to kind of talk about the freedom of religion and the freedom from want. So rather than picking one of those topics, it's actually kind of combining two, trying to project two at the same time. In the center is a view of the New York Harbor with a suggestion of the Statue of Liberty in the distance. But the red is a reflection of the red sky. And one thing I was thinking about with this composition was the old adage, red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. But yet there's still the transition that exists there too between night and day and the change from one to state to another. I think the success of Norman Rockwell's paintings were that he took the high language of the high ideals and brought them back to immediate experience. And I like to think that the paintings I'm working with don't tell you necessarily what to think, but they are an attempt to get you to feel something or get an experience of being in a place, or to be thinking about how places relate one to another. Again, happy to be included in the show Reimagining the Four Freedoms, and I'd like to thank you for letting me come and discuss a little bit of history, the rich history of Norman Rockwell, and to present my own work to you as well. And I'd like to dedicate my talk to my mother and father, both of whom served in World War II, and encourage you to celebrate and enjoy your freedoms. Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate it, and good night.